July 15th, 2017. The kind of day that hikers romanticize and mountain bikers chase. Clear skies, dry air, and the scent of pine thick in the wind. Garrett Kinsley, 37, was many things: a meticulous planner, a devoted father, and a mountain biking savant whose name quietly echoed in the niche world of trail development. But on that particular morning, he was simply a dad giving his son the birthday trip he'd dreamed of for months. Bryson had just turned 12. The trip was his idea, right down to the resort with the pool, the hand-picked trails, even the energy bars. They packed. His enthusiasm was infectious. He'd been counting the days for weeks. Garrett had made sure the trip was flawless. It wasn't just going to hit the trails. It was going to show his son the trails he had helped shape over years of riding and designing. Garrett didn't just ride the mountain, he carved it. And Bryson had been growing into that world. He's pedaling confidently into his father's tire tracks. Olivia, Garrett's wife and Bryson's mother, had waved them off from the driveway with a kiss on the cheek and a teasing warning about sunscreen. In reckless speeds, out. She loved them fiercely, but mountain biking wasn't her world. She respected it, admired their bond over it, but preferred the ground under her feet to stay flat and predictable. She had expected the usual check-in call that evening. Garrett never missed one, especially not when he was out on a ride. But that night, her phone stayed silent. She made dinner. She scrolled absent-mindedly through social media. She paced the kitchen once. Then again, when she finally climbed into bed, it was with the uneasy reassurance that cell reception was spotty in the deeper trails of Tahoe. She fell asleep telling herself they were probably soaking in the hot tub or watching cable TV with bikes leaned against the hotel wall. But the next morning, that silence turned sharp. No calls. No texts. No read receipts. Garrett and Bryson weren't home. Olivia was scheduled for another 12-hour shift at the hospital. She checked her phone every 10 minutes between patients, every break a new thread of anxiety tightening in her chest. By 2 p.m., she'd left 3 voicemails. All went unanswered. By 4 p.m., she knew something was wrong. By 5 p.m., she had called the resort. They had checked in. They hadn't returned. Their bags were still in the room, the beds untouched. The key cards hadn't been used since the morning before. The receptionist sounded uneasy. Olivia called the Placer County Sheriff's Office. Within 2 hours, a patrol unit had located Garrett's SUV parked at the Granite Loop. Trail had a sprawling gateway to some of Tahoe's most challenging and remote terrain. The car was locked. No signs of distress. No notes. No broken windows. It was parked like he intended to come back that evening. The air changed. What had started as a missed call now breathed like a tragedy in progress. The Granite Loop wasn't a casual trail. It was a junction point connecting to over 100 miles of technical single-track, switchbacks, drop-offs, and old Forest Service roads. It wasn't just one trailet. It was a map of possibilities. SAR teams scrambled fast. Helicopters were dispatched. Drones swept low over dense forest canopies. Volunteer mountain bikers familiar with the terrain joined the effort. But Garrett wasn't a typical rider. He was elite. SAR commanders had to shift their tactics. Instead of searching like they would for a lost tourist, they had to think like him. They had to assume he could have not would have taken Bryson deep into the high-skill Black Diamond trails. By July 17th, it logged over 30 square miles of search. The terrain was steep and broken. Helicopters used thermal imaging to look for heat signatures. Ground crews scanned for tire tracks, energy bar wrappers, displaced soil, something, anything. But there was nothing. No broken limbs, no torn clothing, no impact site, no skid marks, not even a water bottle. It was as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. Then a lead. 2 hikers experienced local. They reported seeing a father and son descending toward the Skyline Descent Trail around 2 p.m. on July 15th. They were confident, happy, in rhythm with the trail. The hikers remembered Bryson specifically impressed at how nimble he looked for a kid so young. His red and white bike with the white coil rear suspension stood out like a flare. But that was the last anyone ever saw of them. The Skyline Descent Trail was a monster expert level. high elevation, brutal exposure. From its name alone, you could tell the margin for error was slim. Cliffside turns, drop-ins with no forgiveness. Not a trail you wandered into. You earned your way there. Special rope teams were deployed. They rappelled into ravines and hung from unstable cliff walls, scanning rock faces with binoculars and infrared scopes. No sign, no sound, just granite and wind. 3 weeks passed. The search was scaled down. What was once a full-court press became a quiet rotation of volunteers and specialists, chasing theories. The working theory was an accident, a tragic crash. Maybe they went off the edge. Maybe they were buried under loose scree or treefall. Maybe an animal attack. But none of those explanations fit. No gear, no blood, no bikes, no bodies. And then the trail froze. The case became the Kinsley disappearance, another ghost story from the Sierra Nevada. Olivia refused to believe they were just gone. She haunted forums, wrote emails, pushed investigators to reopen searches when the snow melted. She kept Garrett's toothbrush in a Ziploc bag in case new forensic tools emerged. She organized vigils and handed out flyers long after the world moved on. For 5 years, the trail sat cold, until a hiker named Ronan Vesper saw something strange. Wedged into a cliff face 160 feet above a desert, canyon floor miles away from where the original search had focused, 2 mountain bikes, stacked like bones in a vertical crevice. One red and white. The other cyan blue dot. It took binoculars and a long stare for him to process what he was looking at. He took photos, he recorded coordinates, and he made a call to the sheriff's office at first. Authorities were skeptical. Old gear turns up in strange places. But when the photographs came in, the match was undeniable. The Kinsley bikes. 5 years later, suspended. Halfway down a cliff like a message waiting to be found, the discovery would ignite a full-scale investigation, not just into the bikes, but into a motive far deeper, more calculated, and more human than anyone could have imagined. Because what they found in that crevice was only the beginning. August 2022, when Deputy Alan Mesner crested the rim of the arid canyon near the Nevada border, he wasn't expecting much. The coordinates were hours from the original search area, deep in the high desert, where the forest thinned into brittle scrubland, and the trail maps grew vague. The hiker who called it in Ronan Vesper seemed credible. Former park ranger, backcountry soloist, not the type to mistake a couple of trash bikes for a serious lead. But even so, most reports like this fizzled out. This time, it didn't single quotes. Mesner stood on the edge of a 160-foot cliff, the ground crumbling gently beneath his boots, binoculars clutched to his chest. The sun was low, washing the rock in a harsh amber. The air smelled like dry grass and distant fire. Through the lens, he saw them. Wedged into a narrow vertical fissure in the rock wall were 2 full-suspension mountain bikes, one above the other, bright red and white. Cyan blue, exactly. As described in the Kinsley case file, Mesner exhaled slowly and radioed it in. "Visual confirmation," he said. "We've got something real." Back at the Placer County Sheriff's Department, the cold case unit stirred to life, like a body shocked back into rhythm. The photos Vesper had taken were reviewed, enhanced, and compared side by side with the ones Olivia Kinsley had submitted 5 years earlier. Same bikes, same details. Bryson's red and white frame with the custom white coil rear suspension. Garrett's sign-colored rig, high-end, professionally tuned. The gear was weathered, coated in dust, the rubber faded and cracked, but unmistakable. It didn't make sense. This cliff was miles from the skyline descent and even farther from the granite loop where their vehicle had been found. There were no trails near the canyon rim. There's no obvious path from the original site to here. And yet the bikes were here, not on the canyon floor. Not broken against a tree, suspended halfway down a cliff face like a grotesque art installation. The department pulled satellite imaging topographic overlays and past search records. This area had never been searched in 2017. It wasn't even on the radar. It wasn't a logical endpoint, which meant this wasn't an accident. Within 24 hours, A technical recovery team was deployed. They worked in the early morning hours to avoid the worst of the heat, anchoring their lines far back from the edge due to the loose, unstable rim. 2 technicians rappelled down, dust trailing from their boots, and carefully documented the position of the bikes. They weren't just dropped. They were jammed into the rock with precision, the pressure of the fissure holding them tight. Each technician wore a helmet cam. The footage would later show the exact position of every frame, every scratch, every snag of rubber on stone. It took hours to extract them without destroying possible evidence. The bikes were lowered slowly to the base of the canyon, where forensic specialists were waiting with sealed containment bags and documentation protocols. The examination began immediately. At first glance, the damage to the bikes seemed moderate: bent handlebars, scraped paint, cracked gear levers, but not consistent with a crash that involved human bodies. If Garrett and Bryson had been riding the bikes when they fell from this height, the metal would have folded, twisted under the weight and force. Instead, the bikes looked thrown. The evidence was mounting. No blood, no biological material, no signs of impact from human riders. The seats and grips, the pedals and cranks, nothing retained tissue or blood traces. Chemical reagents found no embedded fibers in the frames. 5 years of exposure would degrade evidence, yes, but not entirely erase it. Protected recesses in bike geometry usually hold fragments. Not this time. The conclusion was inescapable. The bikes had not been ridden off the cliff. They had been disposed of, thrown deliberately. The crevice they landed in was never the intended destination. Just a fluke of physics. Investigators believed whoever threw them expected them to plummet all the way to the canyon floor, likely. To be washed into the river that carved the base, gone forever. But fate had lodged them in place. 5 years of silence. Waiting to be found with the bikes in custody, the tone of the case changed. This was no longer a presumed accident. It was a homicide investigation. The case file was reopened. Sources were authorized, and Olivia Kinsley was notified in person. She sat in her living room, the same couch she had slept on countless nights waiting for news. Her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Sheriff's Detective Margot Hess explained the discovery calmly, carefully. Olivia didn't cry. She didn't speak for a full minute, and she simply asked, "Do you think they were alive when the bikes went over?" There was no answer yet. But Detective Hess knew the implication behind the question. The cliff wasn't a trail, so how did the bikes get there? And more importantly, were Garrett and Bryson when it happened? Forensics continued. The bikes were dismantled, piece by piece. Every screw, bolt, and bearing was cataloged and analyzed. The focus wasn't just structural integrity, was contamination. Transfer evidence. And there it was. Inside Garrett's rear suspension. Linkage in impossible location for normal debris. Tiny sliver of oxidized aluminum, circular, worn, and clearly foreign. Not from Garrett's bike. Not a standard part. It took days to confirm it wasn't just trail debris. It was a pedal spacer, used to widen a rider's stance. It's common among pros and obsessive riders, but this one was custom machined. He grade aluminum, non-standard measurements. Unique milling marks. It didn't belong on Garrett's bike, but it was there, embedded in a location that suggested high force transfer, like a collision or a struggle. Investigators now had a physical clue, something they could track. And track it they did. They began canvassing machine shops across Northern California and Western Nevada. Armed with the metallurgical profile and higher resolution images of the machining marks, it took weeks. They found it in Reno, a small, independent. Machinist remembered the batch. He dug through invoices and pulled a work order from 2017. The client was Weston Price, former owner of Summit Slopes Bike Park, a name buried deep in the original investigation. Weston Price had once been a fixture in the Tahoe mountain biking community. Now he was little more than a ghost. After Summit Slopes went bankrupt in 2018, he dropped off the radar. The business had failed spectacularly, losing its core audience and all financial viability, just as Garrett Kinsley's new trail project was gaining national attention. Detectives dug into Price's background again. The original case file had noted a public rivalry with Garrett industry disputes, accusations of stolen designs, fast-tracked permits. But at the time, with no sign of foul play, the tension had been dismissed as professional noise. Now, with Price's custom spacer lodged in Garrett's bike, that noise became signal. They pulled phone records, financial statements, contracts. What they found changed everything. In the spring of 2017, just weeks before the disappearance west on, Price had been subcontracted to perform early excavation work on Garrett's new trail system. He had access to heavy machinery, remote backcountry locations, and most importantly, he knew the layout intimately, including the area where the trail was later rerouted due to supposed unstable ground. The paperwork looked innocuous, but with new eyes, it reeked of manipulation. Investigators compared the planned trail layout, Garrett's version, to the final construction. They found a section of remote hillside, miles from public access where the route had changed suddenly. Days after Garrett and Bryson vanished, the justification, subsurface instability. The timing, July 17, 2017, 2 days after they were last seen. The hair-on detective. Hess's arms stood up. A search team was dispatched. They brought cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of forensic anthropologists. The hillside had grown over 5 years of regrowth and erosion, but beneath the layers of pine needles and silence, the mountains still remembered. One of the dogs alerted. The team began excavation, 4 feet down. In compacted earth, mixed with gravel and loam, the shovel hit bone. They worked slowly, respectfully. What emerged was a male adult skeleton. He was face down, a skull fractured. Burial depth, consistent with heavy equipment, not a hand-dug grave. Dental records confirmed the identity within 48 hours. Garrett Kinsley, the cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. Inflicted by a heavy object with a sharp edge, Olivia was notified personally. Again, she didn't cry. She just asked, "Where's my son?" The answer wouldn't come easily, but it would come. By the time investigators exhumed Garrett Kinsley's body from the rerouted section of trail in late September 2022, the case had morphed from a haunting disappearance to a full-blown homicide investigation. Every assumption from 5 years earlier had been dismantled. Garrett hadn't died in a biking accident. He had been murdered, buried under the very trail system he'd designed, and there was still no trace of Bryson. Detective Margot Hess returned to the Summit Slopes property with a signed search warrant in hand. The place was a shell of what it had once been, a skeletal maze of disused trails, collapsed outbuildings, and rusting machinery. It had been abandoned for years after Weston Price declared bankruptcy, yet he still lived in a dilapidated trailer. On the edge of the property, he answered the door in threadbare jeans, a grease-stained hoodie, and a face hardened by time and loss. Hess didn't waste words. "We found Garrett," she said. Price didn't blink. His eyes held hers, not surprised, not shocked, just still, and in that silence, Hess heard everything she needed to know. The interrogation was methodical. Detectives laid out every piece of evidence, the pedal spacer, the forensic timeline, the GPS data, the rerouted trail, the proximity of Garrett's grave to the excavation zone where Price had been operating equipment on. July 15, 2017, Weston Price didn't ask for a lawyer. He signed a waiver, folded his arms on the table, and began to talk. But his story was incomplete, he admitted. To killing Garrett described a confrontation that escalated a fight on the trail. Words exchanged, tempers flared. Garrett wouldn't listen, he said. Wouldn't stop the project. Price claimed desperation overtook him, picked up a Pelasgia, heavy trail-building two-land, swung it. "One swing," he said flatly. "That's all it took." He described the aftermath in clinical terms. How he used the excavator to dig a hole. How he buried the body under the pretense of shifting the trail due to unstable ground. How no one would question it. And then he mentioned Bryson, the Room changed. According to Price, Bryson had witnessed everything. The boy had been frozen with shock. Then he'd turned and fled riding his bike downhill, off-trail, panic in every pedal. "I didn't chase him," Price claimed. "He was gone." Detectives didn't believe him. The logistics didn't make sense. The terrain was too rough. The boy's bike had been recovered. It was thrown from the cliff alongside Garrett's. Price's version of events didn't account for how. Bryson's helmet ended up in his possession. That detail wasn't public, but it was found during the second sweep of the Summit Slopes property in a rusted shipping container behind the tool shed. Under a pile of old tires, half covered with canvas, they found a child's white helmet with red flame designs. The same helmet Bryson had been wearing in the last known photo. The presence of the helmet in Price's possession proved one thing. With grim certainty, Bryson had never ridden away. The confession unraveled under scrutiny. Price insisted that he panicked and assumed Bryson had fled. That he never found the boy. That maybe the kid had crashed or gotten lost. But the helmet told a different story. So did the timeline. Garrett was killed. Noon on July 15th. Price was in the area for at least another 2 days, confirmed. By work logs, GPS data, and his cell phone pinging off local towers. During that window, disposed of the bikes, driving them miles away to the cliff above the river canyon. Throwing them over the edge to destroy evidence. He had the time. He had the opportunity. And in the mind of every investigator on the case he had, the motive Bryson was a witness. A 12-year-old boy who could identify the killer. A liability. But what happened to him? That was the unanswered question still tormenting Olivia Kinsley. She had mourned Garrett. She had buried him in October, surrounded by friends, family, and silence. But Bryson's absence was a vacuum no ritual could fill. No remains, no answers. Only theories. The investigation expanded. Detectives subpoenaed every piece of data connected. To Weston Price from July through August 2017, vehicle records. Gas station logs, phone history, surveillance footage, everything. They found something 3 days after Garrett and Bryson were reported missing before the active search had even peaked. Price's truck had traveled hundreds of miles north to Idaho, more specifically, to an isolated, heavily forested region near the Lemhi Range. A small rural property. No cell towers, cameras. No neighbors for miles. The land had been owned by a man named Randall Presa, cousin of Weston's. He died in 2021 before that. Randall had operated a controversial wilderness therapy program for troubled teens. Unlicensed, unregulated. A place whispered about on parenting forums as extreme and off the grid. No medical oversight, no intake records. And after his death, the camp had been shut down and abandoned. Detectives visited the property. What they found was haunting. Cabins with broken windows, moldy bunk beds, old restraints still nailed to trees. The ashes of burned documents in rusted barrels. A landscape built for isolation, for forgetting. They canvassed nearby towns. Showed pictures of Bryson. Most residents were wary, silent. One man, a gas station attendant, claimed he remembered a woman bringing a boy in for supplies sometime in mid-2017. She paid cash. The boy didn't speak, just stared. Was it Bryson? He wasn't sure. The investigation stalled again. No paper trail. No DNA. No definitive proof Bryson had been there. But the possibility now existed. Horrifying one. That Bryson had survived. That he had been given away, not murdered. Erased. The Kinsley case had already defied. Probability once when 2 mountain bikes snagged in a cliff crack instead of falling into a river. Could it happen again? Could a boy traumatized, voiceless, buried in a backwoods therapy camp, have grown into a teenager? Even a man unaware of who he was? That became the new mission. Detectives contacted National Missing Children's databases. Facial recognition analysts were brought in to age-progress Bryson's features. Tips were released quietly with tight controls to avoid spooking any possible lead dozens of false hits, dead ends, lookalikes. But one day, in early February 2023, a call came in from a youth rehabilitation center in Spokane, Washington. A 17-year-old boy had arrived 2 months earlier. No name, no records. He had been found sleeping in a warehouse, malnourished, barely spoke, said he didn't remember anything before age 12. He had a scar on his left wrist, a childhood injury Olivia had told investigators about a crash in second grade. They sent a team and a DNA swab. The results came back 48 hours later. Positive match. It was Bryson. The DNA confirmation hit the Placer County Sheriff's Department like a lightning strike. After 5 years of assumptions, closed case files, and quiet graveside visits, the truth had cracked open in a way no one could have anticipated. Bryson Kinsley was alive, 17 years old, malnourished, emotionally unresponsive, but alive when Detective Margot S. and a trauma specialist from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children arrived at the youth rehab center in Spokane. They didn't find the reunion they'd imagined. Bryson was withdrawn, guarded, and disoriented. He barely responded to his own name. He'd been calling himself Connor. He wasn't combative, just ... absent. As if his brain had been warned off from his own past. They'd been warned. Severe childhood traumas, especially when combined with long-term emotional manipulation and isolation, could induce a kind of dissociative amnesia. It wasn't just forgetting. It was neurological survival. Still, Detective Hess showed him a photo-annulled image of a grinning 12-year-old. Wearing a red and white helmet next to his father, he stared at it for almost a minute, then his lips moved. "That's him," he said. "The man in the photo. That's the one who died." He said it flatly. It's like someone recalling a scene from a dream they weren't sure they'd had. Bryson was placed under protective supervision immediately. Olivia flew to Spokane the following morning. She was advised not to expect a storybook reunion. No warm embrace, no instant recognition. They met in a quiet therapy room. She entered slowly, carrying a photo album and the same green thermos she used to fill with cocoa on his childhood ski trips. Bryson sat on the couch, hands knotted in his lap. He looked at her like one might look at a distant cousin. Familiar, but unreachable. "I'm your mom," she said gently. "I've never stopped looking for you." Bryson nodded once. His eyes glistened. But he didn't cry. They sat in silence for almost 20 minutes before he asked the first question. "Did he scream?" She froze. "Garrett," he said. "My ... dad. Did he scream when the man hit him?" Olivia shook her head slowly. "He died instantly, sweetheart. There was no pain." Bryson exhaled, like a balloon deflating after years of pressure. Then, the first time, he reached for her hand. What followed was a slow unraveling. Not all at once, but over weeks of therapy, memory exercises, and trust building. Fragments began to return. He remembered the confrontation. Weston Price shouting, his dad turning, confused. A blur of movement, the swing of something heavy, a sickening sound, then terror. Bryson said he tried to run. He didn't get far. Something hit him. Hard. The next thing he remembered clearly was waking up in the back of a truck, disoriented, nauseous. His helmet was gone. His clothes were different. They drove for hours. He asked where his dad was. The man said, "He's gone." "You're not him anymore." Bryson didn't understand. They arrived at a place in the woods. Cabins. Men with hard eyes and radios. No names, just rules. Chores, punishments, a new name. Connor. He learned quickly not to ask questions. Not to. Cry not to speak of before, because every time he did, they locked him in the quiet box. A small, insulated shed with no windows. Days at a time, till time stopped meaning anything. Eventually the memories faded, or were pushed away. He forgot Garrett's face, Livia's voice, even his own name. But some part of him remembered enough to survive. Back in California, the district attorney amended the charges against Weston Price. He was already in custody for the murder of Garrett Kinsley, but with Bryson's reappearance, His fragmented testimony, the case transformed again. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, child endangerment, psychological torture, attempted murder. It was more than enough for a second trial. Price's defense attorney argued diminished capacity, mental duress, bankruptcy, despair, loss of livelihood. But the jury didn't buy it. Not after hearing Bryson's taped testimony, not after seeing the photo of the helmet found on Price's property, not after forensic psychologists confirmed. The camp where Bryson was left had never been registered, never inspected, and had changed names 3 times to avoid legal scrutiny. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Weston Price was convicted on all counts. He received a second life sentence, this time without the possibility of parole. Olivia and Bryson returned to California under strict anonymity. Media interest exploded after the trial. But the courts sealed identifying details to protect Bryson's recovery. He struggled in public. Crowds triggered him. Voices raised above a certain tone made him flinch. He slept with the light on and the window closed. He would not go near a bike, but in small steps began to rebuild. He liked chess, dogs, music, not much else yet, but it was something. He saw his father's grave for the first time on a gray afternoon in March. Olivia stood beside him, silent. Bryson traced his fingers over the engraved name. "I remember his voice," he whispered. "I didn't think I did, but ... it came back." "Oh, yeah." Then he sat in the grass for a long time, just staring at the stone. No tears, no breakdown, just presence. One final thread remained. The Wilderness Therapy Camp. It had been shut down officially in 2021 after Randall Price's death, but its legacy still lingered. Investigators wanted to know how many other children had passed through it, who they were, where they went. They began interviewing former staff, locals looking for other Connors. That investigation is ongoing, but in early 2024, a burned journal was recovered from a storage unit Randall Price had rented under a false name. It was water damaged. Pages missing, but inside, written in shaky block letters, was a list. Each name had a birth date, a fake name beside it, and a number Connor was. #12. There were 19 in total. Of the remaining 18, only 7 have been located. The others are still missing. In the weeks following Weston Price's conviction, public focus shifted, but the investigation didn't. Behind closed doors, law enforcement quietly opened a new case file, Project Connor. At the center of it was the half-burned journal retrieved from the storage unit Price's cousin had rented under the name Stephen Ulrich. The list of 19 children, each with a birth date, a false name, and a number, was now the focus of a federal multi-agency effort involving the FBI, the Department of Health and Human Services, and state-level missing persons units across 3 states. Bryson Kinsley had been #12 of the remaining 18. 7 had been accounted for. 2 were confirmed as having been legally placed in alternative foster care after fleeing the camp. 3 had been adopted under sealed court documents in Montana and were slowly being tracked through redacted family court records. 2 more, both girls, had been located in a residential rehabilitation program in Idaho. Their true identities only confirmed through DNA. After refusing to speak for months, that left 11 children aged between 7 and 14. At the time of entry and accounted for, no matching social security numbers, no school records, no medical insurance traces, just aliases and silence. Bryson, though not officially part of the Project Connor investigation, remained central to its progression. After his return, trauma specialists worked with him using memory recall techniques, scent associations, art therapy, cognitive interviews. Some things surfaced, not names exactly, but images. He described one boy older, maybe 13, who called himself Mac. He remembered Mac carving a star into the wooden bunk above his bed. He remembered a girl named Ellie who used to braid strings into her shoelaces. He remembered a cabin with a leaky roof, the cold nights, the beatings when they broke, code silence, the presence of cameras hidden in trees. Some memories were dreamlike. Others were agonizingly clear. He described a boy taken away after a failed escape attempt, dragged from the mess hall in front of everyone. No one saw him again. The staff said he was reassigned. Bryson didn't know what that meant. Neither did the investigators. But the pattern was clear. Whoever ran the camp had intended to erase these children, not through violence, but through anonymity, change their names, starve their memories, relabel their identities until nothing of their previous life remained. In the meantime, Placer County continued to handle the legal closure of the original Kinsley case. In April 2024, Weston Price formally appealed his second conviction. His new legal team, funded quietly by a regional advocacy group with ties to libertarian property rights causes, argued that Bryson's memory had been tainted by coercive forensic therapy, that the camp evidence was circumstantial, and that the introduction of the burned journal constituted prejudicial bias. During sentencing, the appeal was denied. The judge's ruling was swift. This court finds no ambiguity in the physical evidence or the corroborated psychological record of the victim. The assertion that a survivor of years-long captivity is an unreliable witness, due to the very trauma inflicted by the accused, is a grotesque inversion of justice. Price would not see another courtroom. He would die in prison. For Olivia and Bryson, life had settled into a quiet, strange rhythm. They lived in a suburb near Sacramento, under a changed surname, in a rented home provided through a state victim assistance program. Olivia had returned to part-time nursing. Bryson had been assigned a full-time educational therapist and a private tutor. He struggled with attention span, emotional regulation, and physical touch. But he made steady progress. He could recite state capitals. He loved puzzles. He no longer flinched at sudden sounds. He still hadn't ridden a bike. But one day, while walking past a trailhead with his mother, he paused at a wooden trail sign. He read the name Skyline Descent. Then he turned to Olivia. "I remember that one," he said. "That's where we were going that day." She nodded, silent. A moment passed. He looked at her. "Can we go down it someday? Just walk." She reached for his hand. "Someday," she said. In June 2024, a body was recovered near the Lemhi National Forest. A hiker reported what looked like animal bones. But when search and rescue arrived, they uncovered a shallow grave, hidden behind a granite outcrop near a no-defunct fire road. The remains were that of a child. Estimated age, 11 to 13. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Dental records were non-existent. No DNA match in CODIS, but inside, a torn, rotted hoodie pocket. Searchers found a metal star, rusted, hand-carved. Later, when shown the photo, Bryson identified it without hesitation. That was Max. He said the child listed as number 8 in the journal. There would be no more appeals. By the summer of 2024, the investigation known internally as Project Connor had expanded beyond what any agency initially anticipated. It was no longer just a case about one child's survival. It was now a full-scale effort to trace the fate of nearly a dozen vanished children whose only shared link was a crude list hidden in a dead man's storage unit. Bryson Kinsley, though not always physically involved, remained at the center of it. His testimony had helped uncover 2 more identities from the journal. One was a girl he remembered as Ellie, short for Eleanor, who used to tie knots in her shoes to remember her real name. The other was Lucas, a boy who had once drawn maps in the dirt of where he thought home used to be. Both of their real names were eventually confirmed through photo arrays and missing persons reports from 2015. Eleanor Ruiz, missing from Eugene, Oregon. Lucas Marr, vanished during a custody dispute in Arizona. Neither had ever been found. Not alive, not dead. Just missing. Until now. The reopened investigations into Eleanor and Lucas began with a brutal question. Where had they gone after the camp? The therapy site was only the beginning. Randall Price Weston's cousin and the camp operator had no digital records, no case files, no paperwork. But forensic techs recovered fragments from 2 old, water-damaged laptops found in the same storage unit as the journal. Buried in corrupted storage was a spreadsheet. No headers. Just rows of data, numbers, dates, and cryptic abbreviations. One column, when compared against known data, appeared to track exits. Bryson's line number 12 had 7.18. 17W gives I. That matched the date price drove Bryson to Idaho and likely stood for Weston to Idaho. Eleanor's row read 10.03. 16R gives S. Lucas's read August 15th, 16. R gives NM detectives interpreted R as Randall, and the arrows as a change in custody or location. S. Possibly Spokane. NM was likely New Mexico. The spreadsheet became the cornerstone of a secondary case in New Mexico. Investigators found what they feared: an unlicensed boarding facility that had been closed in 2019 following a series of abuse complaints that were never pursued. It had operated under various names, one of them Clearpath Ministries. At its height, it housed 30 children. The records were sloppy, names changed, paperwork forged. When detectives began interviewing former staff, 2 of them recalled a boy who didn't speak much, who flinched at the sound of gravel under boots, and who kept trying to dig holes in the courtyard. He said he was making a map, one staffer recalled. Said he was going to find his way back. Back where? I don't know. Photos were pulled. Bryson confirmed it immediately, Lucas. That location buried under a new layer of real estate. Development became the site of another dig. And on August 19, 2024, in a dry trench outside an old barn near Santa Rosa, they found a child's skeletal remains. Dental impressions matched Lucas Marr. The cause of death was inconclusive. There were no visible fractures, no weapon trauma. But the pathologist's report cited long-term malnutrition and signs of untreated illness. Lucas hadn't been killed. He'd been forgotten to death. Meanwhile, Livia Kinsley had become a reluctant advocate. She had always shunned the media attention, avoiding interviews and offers to publish the story. But with each child found, each fragment of truth uncovered, she began working behind the scenes with legislators in California and Idaho to push for the regulation of wilderness therapy programs and behavioral reform camps. The existing laws were a patchwork. Some states required licenses, others didn't. Some allowed parents to place children in facilities with zero medical oversight. In rural areas, especially where law enforcement was scarce, entire operations could run undetected, or worse, ignored, Olivia testified, anonymously before a California state Senate panel in September 2024. Her voice was calm, unwavering. These children weren't rescued, she said. They were stumbled upon. And only because someone failed to throw a bike far enough. Bryson remained quiet during that time. He had grown taller, his posture more relaxed. Could go into grocery stores now, talk to strangers. But he avoided the news. He didn't ask about Lucas. He didn't ask about Ellie. Until one morning, Olivia found him outside in the backyard, sketching something into the dirt with a stick. "What's that?" she asked. He looked up. "A map," he said. She crouched. Beside him, to where? He paused. "I don't know yet." Then he added, almost absently, "But I remember what her voice sounded like." "Whose?" "Ellie's." In Spokane, another breakthrough. A retired postal worker came forward after seeing a local bulletin about Project Connor. He recalled delivering letters to a strange house outside town, a place where teenagers were always doing yard work but never playing, never going to school. Everything felt off, he said. They never looked up. They never made noise. He remembered one girl, long dark hair, always wearing the same hoodie. One day, he saw her scrawling something into the mailbox post with a nail. He reported it to the property manager. Nothing happened. The postal worker no longer had his route. He gave the address. When investigators arrived, the house was empty. But on the underside of the old metal mailbox, still barely visible under layers of rust and paint, were 3 letters: E. Lee. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. They brought dogs. Still nothing. But in a broken brick, under the back depths, they found a fabric bracelet, purple string, blue beads, a small shell. Bryson identified it instantly. "Ellie made those," he said. "She used to say she was going to keep one until she got home." But Eleanor Ruiz has not yet been found. As of October 2024, she remains missing. Case number 12, once presumed dead, had returned. Cases number 8 and number 5 had been found in shallow graves. The others, number 1 through number 19, remain the subject of an ongoing federal task force. But for the first time, the narrative had shifted from one of loss to one of recovery. And a boy who remembered enough to start drawing maps again. Winter came early in 2024. By mid-November, the Tahoe region was blanketed in snow, but the investigation surrounding Project Connor didn't pause. The list from Randall Price's journal remained pinned to a corkboard in the FBI's Sacramento field office. 17 rows. 6 names now confirmed. 3 bodies recovered. 1 survivor, Bryson, and still 10 entries with nothing but code names and faded dates. While the media's attention had drifted, consumed by election noise, market volatility, and international conflict, the case teams continued working in silence. Following cold trails through old files, half-forgotten child welfare complaints, and unverified sightings stretching back nearly a decade, it wasn't just about proving what had happened anymore. It was about exposing how it was allowed to happen, and who else knew. The break came not from new forensic evidence, but from a man named Harlan Fincha, former contractor and maintenance worker for multiple behavioral reform facilities across Idaho and Utah between 2015 and 2018. Finch, now in his 60s, had been arrested in Boise on unrelated charges: possession of stolen property. During processing, his prints flagged a connection to multiple prior employee rosters under aliases. After a brief interview, he offered information in exchange for a lighter sentence, and then, quietly, Finch began naming names: supervisors, administrators, religious organizations, property managers, private funders. He described a loose but intentional network of off-grid facilities operated under religious exemptions, cash donations, and nonprofit front organizations that funneled at-risk or inconvenient children, especially those with complex custody issues, into remote residential programs with no oversight. "The Price camp," he said. "That was just one of maybe a dozen places like that. Same style, same setup. Keep him quiet. Keep him scared." Finch's claim was impossible to verify without physical evidence. But he offered something more valuable. He had kept a logbook. The book, retrieved from a locked footlocker in his trailer, was written in a shorthand that took days to decode. It listed dates, initials, and basic notes, drop-offs, supply deliveries, camp names, on one page. Under the date 9.24/16, a notation read, "ER moved, small, quiet, new name, LI." FBI analysts cross-referenced it with Eleanor Ruiz's original disappearance. She had gone missing on September 20th, 2016. Finch was asked directly, "Did you transport her?" He nodded. "She cried for 2 days. Said she had a brother. Her mom would find her, but she stopped talking eventually. They always did." He identified Ellie from a photo, then drew a crude map. Nothing official, just a memory of turns and landmarks. But it was enough. On December 4th, 2024, agents found the decaying remains of a burned-out cabin in central Utah. It matched the location. They searched for 3 days. On the 4th, they found her. A shallow grave, small bones, a purple beaded bracelet. Bryson didn't need to be shown the photo. He knew the identification of Eleanor. Ruiz brought the confirmed count to 4 deceased. Of the 19 names in Randall Price's list, only 9 were still unaccounted for. But the pressure was mounting from elsewhere now in institutions. The Department of Health and Human Services released an internal audit revealing that in 2016 and 2017, over 2,400 minors were placed in unlicensed residential programs across 5 western states, many with religious exemptions shielding them from federal regulation. Some had been investigated, Few were shut down, even fewer were prosecuted. The discovery of Garrett, Kinsley's body, and the unraveling of Weston Price's crimes had opened a Pandora's box, and some inside the system were desperate to shut it. Again, Olivia Kinsley received an anonymous envelope in January 22-5, no return address, no letter, just a small flash drive. It was delivered through regular mail, with no fingerprints, no postage history. Inside were 6 photographs, grainy time dash stamped. Each one showed a child, dirt paths, distant cabins, armed men in the background, makeshift fences. The file names were numbers, #3, #9, number 11, number 14, number 16, #18. Bryson reviewed the photos. He didn't recognize them all, but he froze at one. That one, he whispered. That's Ezra. Ezra had been a quiet kid, maybe 10 years old, always humming under his breath. Liked to stack rocks behind the cabins. He'd been assigned number 14 until that moment. No one had even known his first name. The FBI traced the origin of the photos to a defunct email account, once linked to a digital camera manufacturer based in Oregon. It had been activated for just 2 days in 2020, just long enough to upload these images. They traced the IP, addressed to a library in Montana. Surveillance footage from that day was overwritten years ago, but it suggested something crucial. Someone else was watching. Someone had archived these children's faces, names, numbers, patterns, and they had held on to that evidence for years before sending it not to the FBI, but to Olivia, a mother, a civilian. Why? Because they didn't trust the system anymore? By February 2025, the FBI had compiled a full composite of the 19 children. 6 were confirmed deceased. 1, Bryson, was alive. 12 remained missing. The case was no longer about Weston Price. It was about infrastructure, negligence, intentional blind eyes. A congressional subcommittee was formed to investigate federal failures in tracking children placed in private therapeutic programs, especially those without licensing or accreditation. Among the exhibits shown during testimony were the 2 bikes, wedged into the rock face above the Nevada Canyon. Still dusty, still intact, still silently marking the moment the Kinsley mystery became something much, much bigger. On March 3, 2025, the subcommittee heard from its final witness. He was 17, wearing a gray button-down shirt. Hands shaking, he didn't have a speech. He just told them what he remembered. The bikes, the trail, the man, the fear. The way his name disappeared. The way it came back. My name, he said, is Bryson Kinsley. And there are others out there, like me. He paused. They remember more than you think. You just have to help them feel safe enough to say it. The room was silent, and then one of the representatives, an older woman from Colorado, spoke quietly. Bryson, do you think we can still find them? He looked up and said, we have to. Spring 2025 arrived, not with closure, but with reckoning. By now, the story had spread beyond missing children. It had become something else, an indictment of a system too fractured. It's forgiving and far too easy to manipulate. The phrase behavioral shadow network entered headlines. News anchors said it cautiously, unsure whether it described a conspiracy, a tragedy, or both. Federal officials called it a decentralized pipeline of unauthorized juvenile placements under religious exemption, or medical pretense. Parents called it their worst nightmare, and survivors, those who had voices, called it hell. The FBI's Victim Tracking Unit, now fully embedded in Project Connor, released a list of all 19 entries from Randall Price's journal of the remaining 12 unaccounted for identifiers. 7 were listed as having last known locations across, possibly never documented past arrival in collaboration with nonprofit partners. The agency began distributing anonymized composites of each child's aged-up likeness, including hair variants, dental identifiers, unique childhood traits remembered by other victims. One of the girls, referred to as number 3, was believed to have had a small tattoo, a blue ink butterfly on her shoulder, added by one of the older teens in camp as protection. Bryson remembered it. So did two other survivors. They called her Sky. She had been quiet, protective. She had once smuggled a protein bar to Bryson when he was too weak to stand. And then one day, she was gone. In May 2025, an anonymous tip was emailed to the Project Connor task force. The subject line, "Sky is in Montana." Attached were 3 photos. A girl, now older, hair dyed black, working at a roadside cafe outside Livingston, Montana. No ID, paid in cash, known only as Kayla. The FBI deployed a small team. Quiet. No media. They approached her outside the diner during a smoke break. She didn't run. She didn't speak. But when they showed her a photo of the blue butterfly tattoo drawn from memory by another survivor, she froze. Then she nodded once. Tears didn't come until later. Her name was Skylar Monroe. She'd gone missing from Sacramento in 2016 at age 13. No active Amber Alert had ever been issued. Her disappearance had been filed under runaway. Due to a custody dispute between her divorced parents, she had been processed into the Price camp under the alias Mina. Her logbook entry had read simply, "Number 3, quiet, defensive. Watch her." She'd lasted 6 months before being relocated to a secondary facility in western Montana. There, she'd been forced to take on a new name, perform farm labor, and adhere to silence rules enforced with electric shock devices designed for animals. She escaped in 2020. She had no family support and no memory of her original social security number, so she became Kayla. And she survived by disappearing more deeply. Skylar's reemergence changed everything. She had not only survived, but remembered everything. Names, faces, transfer vans. Even an incident where she witnessed a group of men burying a child after discipline went too far. She couldn't say who it was, but she remembered the bracelet, purple beads. A small shell was Skylar's cooperation. The FBI mapped out 3 previously unknown transfer sites' makeshift handoff points, used to move children between facilities without documentation. One of them was a remote ranch near the Idaho-Montana border, long abandoned, partially collapsed, inside the barn. Brittle, but legible in places. Each folder contained a series of handwritten intake sheets. All first names fake, no last names, just intake numbers and dates. One folder was labeled number 18, Ease. Another number 6, M. Lucas, and 1 had been scratched out. But the intake photo inside, water-damaged and curled, was unmistakable. Bryson, he hadn't seen it before, stared at it for nearly 5 minutes when they handed it to him. "I didn't know they ever took pictures," he said. The image showed him bruised, head shaved, eyes wide with fear. He looked smaller than he remembered. Being more lost, he didn't say anything else. The files helped identify 2 more children from the list. #18, Ethan S., missing from Reno in 2015, age 11. Number 10, Maria D., missing from rural Utah in 2014. Age 13, Ethan's remains were found in early June, buried on the edge of the transfer site. His cause of death was later determined to be exposure and neglect. Maria had no grave, but Skylar remembered her. She remembered the way she walked, always limping on her right foot after an untreated ankle fracture. She remembered how Maria once stood up for another girl during a punishment and was locked in isolation for nearly a week. She remembered the screams, then silence. By June 2025, Project Connor had accounted for one survivor, Bryson Kinsley, too. Confirmed living recoveries, Skylar Monroe. Girl identified as number 7 in Idaho 6. Confirmed deceased Lucas, Ellie, Garrett, Mac, Ethan. Maria 10 names remaining, all with some degree of photo-anecdotal or file-based corroboration. The scope had expanded so widely that the PH Department of Justice created a new, dedicated task force, FMSAP Federal. Interventions for missing children in alternative placements. They were tasked not only with closing out Project Connor, but investigating ongoing programs operating under similar models. As of this writing, 7 facilities across 4 states have been forcibly shut down due to violations uncovered during the Connor investigation. Dozens of children have been removed. Some remember nothing before. Age 10, some remember too much, and some, like Bryson, remember just enough to know how it started. On the 8th anniversary of Garrett and Bryson's disappearance, Olivia Kinsley returned to the trailhead at Granite Loop. She went alone, not as a vigil, not as a statement, just a walk. The trees were taller, the signage updated, but the trail itself was unchanged. Halfway up the incline, she stopped at the marker where they had taken their last photo together. She knelt in the dirt and pressed something into the soil. A photo, Bryson. Age 17, standing beside Skylar, both holding chess pieces, smiling. Awkward, small smiles, but real ones. Behind them was a bulletin board, covered in composite sketches. Children still missing, still waiting, still silent. She didn't cry, she just whispered, "We're still looking." Then, she stood up and walked back down the trail. The silence surrounding Project Connor had grown heavier, not quieter. By late summer 2025, the names left on Randall Price's list were more than missing persons. They had become symbols. 10 faceless numbers representing something larger than disappearance. They were reminders of neglect, complicity, and willful blindness embedded in a system that failed to ask the simplest question: where did they go? And who let them? The task force was now working under full national authorization. FIMCAP had identified a network of 23 unlicensed residential facilities that had operated between 2012 and 2020 under the protection of nonprofit charters, religious exemptions, and ambiguous youth rehabilitation laws. Of the 23, 16 had been shuttered, 7 remained under investigation. Among them, a remote property in southern Colorado stood out. It had never been on any database. It wasn't a registered program, nor had it ever filed for nonprofit status. It had no name, but Skylar Monroe had seen it. She described it in vague terms: snow-capped mountains to the east, a gravel road with black mile markers, and a series of wind turbines visible at sunset. She had only been there once, during a transfer. A layover. She remembered being held in a locked room with a cot, one blanket, and the sound of crying behind the walls. She was told not to talk. She didn't eat, and then she was moved again. But she remembered something else. A boy with a gap in his teeth, in a habit of repeating questions aloud, like he was memorizing them. He told her his name was Avery. On the Randall Price list, #11 had been annotated only as a V isolated. Skylar remembered the way he looked at her when they pulled her out of the room. "Tell them I'm here." She hadn't spoken the name out loud until months later. Now, with enough resources behind the task force, they traced every known property with those environmental markers and found one match. This compound, built in 2014, originally listed as a private nature retreat, leased and quietly sold twice under shell corporations based in Nevada. No activity since. 2021, they sent in a team. What they found was more structure than ruin. Dormitories, holding rooms, surveillance cables still threaded through walls, rooms with two-way mirrors, a basement with soundproof padding and a metal bed frame bolted to the floor. It was empty, but it hadn't been abandoned for long. On one wall, drawn faintly in pencil near the edge of a bunk bed, were scratched numbers: 11. AV, below it, a date: the 2nd of October, 2017. That was nearly 3 months after Garrett and Bryson disappeared. The same time, the Price Network rerouted several placements. FIMCAP investigators swept the site for DNA. They recovered strands of hair, blood flecks in the concrete floor, even a partially torn jacket caught in the fencing behind the south wall. A label inside the collar read, Avery V. The FBI notified Avery's parents, Kristen and Joel Varnell, who had last seen their son in August 2016. At the time, they were undergoing a court dispute over joint custody. with Kristen claiming Joel had placed Avery in a short-term wilderness immersion camp following a behavioral referral from a school counselor. The camp, it turned out, had been subcontracted by a private third-party agency, one with no operating license and no physical address. By the time Kristen contacted the sheriff's office, Avery was already gone. The company that referred him had ceased operations within the year. Now, nearly a decade later, investigators had his DNA matched confirmed, but no body, only traces. The working theory: Avery was alive at the Colorado compound for at least 6 months. Whether he was relocated or buried nearby remained unknown. Cadaver dogs were deployed, no alert, but a sealed crawlspace beneath. The east dormitory was discovered bricked in, behind a fake utility closet. Inside, 3 mattresses, 2 empty bins, 1 plastic tub containing torn notebooks, rubber wristbands, and a child's sneaker. Bryson was shown the contents. He recognized the wristband. "I gave him that," he said. "He used to spin it when he was nervous." Bryson didn't say anything more, just turned away. FIMCAP issued a statement. 2 weeks later, they were now working under the assumption that at least 4 of the remaining 10 children had died between 2016 and 2018 in compounds that had since been destroyed, sold, or repurposed, but they believed others were still alive, scattered, hidden, absorbed into the system under false names, or moved across state lines before regulation caught up. One of the most recent leads came from British Columbia, where a wellness retreat for young men had been flagged by the RCMP. A 17-year-old boy, registered under a religious alias, bore significant physical resemblance to one of the Project Connor sketches. Number 17 Devon, an international cooperation request was filed, but before the identity could be confirmed, the boy vanished. The retreat was shut down for zoning violations 2 weeks later. No forwarding address, no client list, no records, just another facility that dissolved when light hit it. Meanwhile, in California, Bryson Kinsley was preparing to speak again, not in court, not to press, but to students. He had been invited to a university criminal psychology seminar to discuss victim memory and long-term trauma narratives. He was 18 now, legally an adult, still in therapy, still rebuilding, but stronger. He agreed to go when he stepped in front of the lecture hall. Wearing a gray zip-up and jeans, the students fell silent. He didn't have a speech, just facts. "Was 12 when I disappeared," he began. "That's not when I stopped existing." He told them about the price camp, the transfers, the boy who asked him math questions to stay sane, the girl who hid bruises with dirt, the counselor who said he'd never get out unless he forgot his name. He talked about the bike, how it got wedged in a cliff because gravity missed. "Wasn't supposed to be found," he said, "but I was." Pause then. "There are others. Don't forget them." That night, after returning home, Bryson asked Olivia a quiet question. If you hadn't gotten that call, if they hadn't found the bikes, do you think anyone would have ever looked again? She didn't lie. "I don't know," she said. "But I would have kept asking, even if no one listened." He nodded. Then he went to his room, and for the first time since he returned, he locked the door from the inside, not because he was afraid, but because he could, because he chose to. The trail that began with 2 missing riders had now exposed something far wider, far deeper. A broken latticework of hidden programs, manipulated children, and missing names that had slipped through institutional cracks and legal loopholes for nearly a decade. By fall 2025, Project Connor had closed or brought legal action against 19 facilities across 5 states. 8 more were still under active investigation. Total, 56 minors had been recovered, 7 of whom were directly tied to Randall Price's network, but not all names would be found. 3 of the original 19 children on Randall Price's list had no corresponding state records, no missing person reports, no known families. Either the records were lost or they'd never existed in any official capacity. One was a girl, listed only as number 19KS. She had never been identified. No composite sketch was possible. No memory from survivors could confirm who she was. She was simply the last name on the list the task force entered her into. NCME as Jane Doe Connor. 2. Come the symbol of the forgotten. In late October, Bryson Kinsley was invited to Washington, D.C. to attend a private hearing on federal youth safety legislation. The bill, known as the Safe Youth Act, had been drafted in response to the findings of Project Connor. It would mandate federal oversight of all residential youth facilities, licensed or unlicensed, religious or secular, and create a national database for children transferred across state lines for behavioral treatment. Bryson was not asked to testify this time, just to sit in the front row. Olivia sat beside him. As the bill passed committee with overwhelming support, the chairwoman nodded toward Bryson. Because someone lived, she said. Others will not be lost. Later that day, Olivia found a quiet corner in the hallway and made a phone call to the Placer County Sheriff's Department. She asked a simple question. Are the bikes still in evidence? They were. She made a request. 2 weeks later, under a gray Tahoe sky, a small group gathered on a newly restored overlook above the old Granite Loop Trail. The area had been closed to the public for years following the investigation, but now, the Sheriff's Department and Trail Conservancy had approved something new. A. Memorial. 2. Refurbished mountain bikes Bryson's and Garrett's cleaned, restored and welded upright, were mounted onto a granite pedestal overlooking the canyon. No plaques, no names, just a single engraving in steel beneath them. Ride together, remember all. It wasn't a monument to tragedy, it was a marker for memory. A physical reminder that something once lost had been found not by chance, but by persistence. Bryson stood at the edge of the overlook. He didn't speak, just watched the wind moving through the trees below. Then he turned to Olivia. I think I want to ride again. She smiled. Okay. In the final report issued by FIMCAP on December 31st, 2025. The summary included a single line under the conclusion section. The survival of one child resulted in the recovery of 7 others. The exposure of a multi-state youth exploitation network, the conviction of 15 individuals, and the permanent closure of 23 unlawful youth facilities. And below that, the case remains open. 8 children from the original price list are still missing. Further recovery is expected. Bryson read the report that night, then closed his laptop in a small notebook beside his bed. He flipped to a blank page and began to sketch mountains, trails, and at the top of a ridge, small wooden sign. It read, "Keep going, someone's waiting."